Hello, and welcome back to our Tuesdays with Dr. Susan series. We are going to be finishing up our eligibility conversation this week with a full chat on specific learning disabilities. We ran out of time to do that last week, and it is a big category, so we wanted to make sure we gave it as much time as we could. Hopefully y'all are doing good this week. I'm going to go ahead and run the intro and bring Susan on, and we will get started. Hi, I'm Nicole, and as you have probably guessed, I have ADHD. I live and breathe all things ADHD in my personal, family, and professional life. I have a background in psychology and special education, and I've gained a lot of knowledge over the years about ADHD, what it really is, how it touches every aspect of your life and the life of your child, as well as a wealth of information and strategies for living with ADHD and parenting kids with ADHD. In this community, we share stories, we learn together, and we support each other as we navigate all things ADHD. Welcome. Hello, friend.
Hello, dear. How are you this week?
Oh, hanging in there. I'm battling with another kidney stone, so might be a little.
I'm very sorry to hear that.
Stupid. I'm just angry about it this time.
Well, I'm glad you were able to get up and let us have this wonderful chat that I look forward to every Tuesday.
Yeah. So hopefully you've had a better week than I have.
Maybe a little. No kidney stone.
So you're one up on me there.
Yeah. So I have in front of me a summary of the eligibility criteria for a specific learning disability. Great. And then I have a list of 7 specific learning disabilities that a child can be considered eligible with.
Okay.
So where shall we start? Definitions or criteria?
Let's start with definitions because the criteria gets complex. So
okay, so let's start with the first one, and you can start us off. The first major specific learning disability is in educational language called specific learning disability of reading. And in medical language, which the federal government now says can be used interchangeably, is called dyslexia. So do you want to start us off with a definition?
Sure. So dyslexia is a learning disability in language that can apply to that it affects reading, right? So it's not what people think of when they think of dyslexia is like seeing letters backwards, right? That's not what dyslexia is. Let's see if I can find. I had.
Oh, okay. I'll get my list.
A better definition.
I thought you could do that.
Where is it?
So basically, dyslexia.
My brain is a little slow today.
That's okay. Dyslexia is difficulties with reading that include decoding and comprehension. And what people don't realize is that decoding, where people talk about flipping the letters, decoding is the ability to read a word as it's written and understand the rules to decode that word on the written page. And comprehension, which is part of dyslexia, is the ability to then understand what you've read out loud or to yourself, I guess. Sure. So it includes both components. Decoding, which can affect writing, spelling, all those grammar, because if you can't read the words, because when you look at the page, the letters might be floaty. You look at the page and you see letters switched with each other. So instead of cat, A-C-T, C-A-T, you might see act, A-C-T. same letters, but they don't read
Very
properly.
different meaning.
So you can't decode them, and therefore it impacts your comprehension. Right? It also impacts your spelling, because if you can't decode a word and put the letters and the syllables in the correct order, you can't spell the word.
Right. You can't decode. It's hard to encode those words. So when we're
Great.
talking about decoding, when I was in the lower elementary school, we're talking about things like phonemic awareness. So
Yes.
knowing, what letters make what sounds and how to put those sounds together to make a word. So oftentimes, we'll talk about interventions for these things later, but that phonemic awareness also has to do with like how can you hear how many syllables are in a word? Can you give the individual sounds and then chunks of sounds, right? So like
Yes.
ing always says ing. Can you see, chunks like that, breaking those things down? And that's where these kids tend to really struggle.
And one of the issues is that a lot of kids, you hear the term stealth dyslexia a lot, but really all that means is that kids were able to handle these earlier building blocks because it involves a lot of rote memory. And sometimes kids with dyslexia and adults with dyslexia are good with rote memory because
they can memorize the words.
Right. And sight language, and they can memorize some of the phonemic combinations, the easier ones, because we read easier words with 1 and 2 syllables in the earlier grades. And then it shows up later, 4th, 5th grade, even middle school, because the material is harder, more complex, more syllables,
and harder to sound out. You get up into those bigger words where the words don't follow the rules and have to figure those out. So, and a lot of times people will talk about stealth dyslexia when they're talking about like the twice exceptional kids, right? Where they have skills and abilities that can make up for some of those weaknesses, and they're very good at hiding and getting around and looking like they know what they're doing.
You don't realize your kid has trouble reading because they're using contextual cues with words they do know or pictures in elementary school books.
And so then later on it can show up in
or they've watched the movie for a teenager.
And then it shows up in different ways later on, some, behaviorally, or they're fatiguing really easily, or, they're smart enough to do the thing, but they are not keeping up with their work. And that's when kind of an evaluation, and all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, they've really got this weakness in this area of reading that is really causing some trouble for them. But because they're still performing, at grade level or oftentimes above grade level, it didn't show up on anyone's radar.
Right. So now dyscalculia, the second of the major specific learning disorders, which is known in educational terms as specific learning disability in math. Again, the federal government says you can use those terms interchangeably. You have to remind schools sometimes, is exactly the same kind of problem, but now you're dealing with numbers instead of letters. And so they don't understand the weight or value of numbers. Think about a number line and how many of us, certainly in my generation, learn to count by jumping numbers on the number line. But they're not able to understand that abstract concept of how numbers work together. And so therefore they can't solve algebraic equations. This is often why it shows up later. Addition and subtraction is hard enough. Multiplication and division could be beyond somebody. And certainly algebra can be when you hit that stumbling block, because they don't have the abstract symbolic thinking necessary to be successful in math.
And then when you start to get into
dyslexia. Go ahead.
when you get into multi-step operations, right? So a lot of times it
Exactly.
shows up when they get into long division where they have to multiply,
The
divide, add,
numbers straight
subtract, and do it, all and yep, keep things in
and keep
order
the
and
numbers straight.
mhm,
That's part of the difficulty. And
yeah.
some of the interventions here have a lot to do with helping students. It's almost easier in some way than dyslexia because it's helping students keep their numbers lined up and helping them understand using manipulatives so that they can see concretely what
Yeah.
they can't see symbolically.
And there are so many other strategies that you can
Right.
use
We
to
can have
get
a
to
whole
the same
session about
answer,
this. Right.
right?
Right.
My
So you have
husband used my
multiple
desk
ways.
all weekend and my chair's not in the right place. So I got
Oh
to
no. So this is often where, even
There we go.
me, my kids came home doing multiplication differently than I learned it. And
Yes.
so I had to wrap my mind, and I don't have dyscalculia. I'm pretty good at math. I had to wrap my mind around new strategies for doing math. And then if you
Yeah.
have dyscalculia on top of that, where you can't do the math no matter what strategy you're being taught, and your parents can't help you because they haven't learned the new strategies.
Yes,
So
the
there's a
new
lot
the
of
new way
places
they're
to
teaching math
intervene.
is so much more conceptual first, which is great because it does help those kids understand why they're doing certain
Mhm.
operations and why they work.
I
But
like some of the new strategies really well.
it really sets them up for higher level math thinking later on by understanding those concepts and why they're doing what they're doing and how those numbers work. But the kids who struggle with math, those concepts are just like they don't connect in their brains. And these are kids who oftentimes will do better with just the traditional algorithm. Here's the one way you do this kind of problem and just do it this way every time.
Yes.
And so that's not how it's being taught right now. So I think these kids are showing up a little bit more
Mhm.
than they once were because they were able to kind of hide under those traditional algorithms
Right.
before and not necessarily forced to have all of that conceptual knowledge.
And here's one where in dyslexia, we talked about how memorization can help many of these kids by learning sight words
Mhm.
or memorizing certain letter combinations. And so we don't catch the dyslexia till later. But that seems to be not so true in math. In
Mhm.
math, the concepts are using a different part of your brain. And so, for example, rote memorization of multiplication tables is not necessarily a skill that many kids with dyscalculia can manage, and you have to
Mhm.
provide accommodations for that. And or whether that's a calculator or a sheet
The
of the
multiplication
multiplication
charts.
tables,
Yeah.
right? Because unlike dyslexia, rote memorization doesn't seem to work quite as well in kids with math disability. They're
Mhm.
just a higher level of symbolism that many kids don't catch right away. Now, let me also say, though, that once you learn what accommodations you need, such as providing a calculator, so kids don't have to do addition, subtraction,
Mhm.
multiplication or division, they then could use those numbers in more advanced ways.
Mhm.
So, providing word problems where they get to use perhaps good verbal language to translate numbers into verbal concepts can be very successful for kids with
Sure.
dyscalculia. Whereas
Yeah.
in dyslexia, since their difficulty is in reading and encoding the words, that
Yep.
doesn't help because
Yeah,
they
dyslexia is going to show
can't read
up
the problem either way.
in math,
And
right?
here's where kids with dyslexia could look like they're having trouble in math because they can't read the word problems correctly.
Right.
They're
It's
getting
language
incorrect
mediated.
answers because they're not reading, Nicole has 7 apples and Susan has 4 apples, how many apples they have. But if you can't read the word apples, then you're not reading the problem correctly. So it's important to be clear whether this is a reading based problem like dyslexia
Right.
or math-based problem like dyscalculia. They can be have difficulty in the same types of problems for different reasons.
Right. And knowing that, I mean, as we said before, once the door is open, once you've kicked that door open, then
Sure.
you have access to whatever you need. So if there's a kid with dyslexia and they're struggling in math, and we can get them some services in math as
Exactly.
well. But knowing why they're struggling in math, because you're going to approach it differently. You're going to approach those
Exactly.
math struggles differently with the kid who has dyslexia, who's struggling with language mediated math things, versus a kid with dyscalculia who the problem is in the understanding of the numbers and how they work together.
Exactly. You said it really well. So number 3 on our list is dysgraphia. And dysgraphia can be confusing. So the educational language is specific learning disability in written expression. Excuse me, a little catch in my throat here. So written expression. And so this piece can consist of several different components.
Mm-hmm.
Stereotypically, even teachers think of this as just a handwriting problem.
Right.
And it can be a significant handwriting problem, but that's not the primary focus of this disability. The primary focus of this disability is having ideas in your head, learning how to organize them into some kind of coherent thought, and then getting them out of your head onto the paper or the computer screen.
Mm-hmm.
So handwriting becomes a problem if you have to handwrite those thoughts that are already confused. The problem is the confusion in your brain. Your thoughts are disorganized, and then your handwriting becomes a problem because there is a motor component, but it's also because what my clients tell me, I'm betting your clinic will say the same thing, Nicole, their brains go faster than their hands, or the words are out of order in their head, and so then they can't write them down correctly.
Yeah.
A lot of these kids I know, went straight to keyboards at young ages, which has helped enormously because they can sort of see it without that significant motor component, or text to, speech to text, even better. But the key issue that people don't realize is that it's a organization in your brain that's the issue. And so therefore, even just handing a kid a keyboard isn't going to teach them how to write a coherent paragraph or a coherent essay. They still have a disability that requires more intervention. You can't just throw a keyboard at this problem.
Sure. This is one that's very highly comorbid with ADHD. A lot of ADHD kids have dysgraphia. All 3 of mine have it, some more severe than others. With my oldest, it's definitely that the brain is moving faster than his hands could ever keep up. And I mean, to this day, like if you were to ask him to handwrite something out, you would think it was done by a kindergartner. The spacing is all over. They can't write on a straight line. It's, the sentence starts here and then the next one starts here and here. And it's just a mess.
Exactly. And that then when they get by 4th or 5th grade into, 5-paragraph essays, and teachers say, okay, write a 1-paragraph intro, 3 paragraphs of body, and a 1-paragraph conclusion, to a neurotypical student, that gives sufficient organization, but that's not sufficient organization for somebody with dysgraphia, because the problem is they don't know how to organize their thoughts. So the body of the paper, I have to have 3 ideas about my topic. I have 27 ideas about this topic.
And I don't have any way of organizing them together.
Right.
That makes
sense.
And
so this is where teachers don't always understand how dysgraphia is not a hand problem, but it's a brain problem. And so the accommodations and supports have to support the brain.
Yes.
And sometimes that's a learning process for teachers.
Yep.
So it came up, as I've said before on this podcast, I am the admin of the Parents of Twice Exceptional Children support group on Facebook, and anyone with a twice exceptional child is welcome to apply to our group. And it came up just this week that somebody said, my kid's in fourth or fifth grade now, or maybe, fifth grade, I think. And, he's losing his handwriting because they're giving him a keyboard all the time and he's forgetting how to handwrite. And, oh no, and how do I teach him how to handwrite? And I basically said, my kid is 30. Oh my God, Nicole, she's going to be 30 next week.
That's wild.
And she was put on a keyboard at the end of first grade. And speech to text was added in sixth grade because they didn't have it before then. And she even had that in college. She had speech to text and a private computer to use for all her tests. And so she's 30 years old. She doesn't handwrite anything.
They don't need
signs
to.
a check. Maybe she writes a grocery list.
But even that, just tap it in your phone,
phone.
Yeah, I don't feel any
types
need
on the
to
computer.
make sure my kids can. I mean, when it comes to third grade and they're learning cursive, and I'm like, fine, they can do it along with it'd be good for them to be able to read cursive, but we are not forcing cursive.
Right. Well, actually, there is some interesting research that says cursive is better or easier to learn.
I could see that because it takes out kind of the spacing issue. Yeah.
Yeah, it's because you never lift your hand off the paper. So there's continuity between the letters. And it's more like drawing because you're making circles and swirls. And kids with dysgraphia can be excellent artists.
Yes.
It's very common with nonverbal learning disability, which is what my daughter has, as well as ADHD. And, my son does not have dysgraphia, and he has ADHD as his primary diagnosis, which is really interesting. But the key point here is that there's no reason to worry if your kids can't handwrite. They have plenty of ways to communicate.
Yeah. And we're in an increasingly, tech-based world where it's just not necessary for them to do that anymore. And they're better off. I mean, my son went into seventh grade and he could type really well. And the teacher's like, well, he's really good at it. I was like, yeah, that's why. That's why that's an accommodation for him, because his typing can almost keep up with his processing speed.
Right.
But
and there's lots of other, interventions. We'll have we'll plan a couple of intervention podcasts later on, Nicole, but today we're just talking about definitions. So big three: dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia, but there are actually several more. So I mentioned nonverbal learning disability as diagnosis my daughter has. This is what shall I say? This is a boundary diagnosis. There are many people who think it's a learning disability, and there are many people who think it's a neurodevelopmental disability like autism. And they're actually doing some work now to get a definition into the DSM, the diagnostic manual that all psychologists and people use to give diagnoses. And the proposed name is visual spatial learning disability. And so nonverbal learning disability means you have difficulty with nonverbal items. So it doesn't mean you don't talk. In fact, they talk a great deal.
Yes.
But it means you have difficulty with visual spatial. So video games can be hard. It means you have trouble finding someplace on a map, trouble with directions, right? You can have difficulty with coordination and fine and gross motor skills. So handwriting becomes an issue again. But also things like learning to ride a bike, because
some of those adaptive skills are often impacted, which
makes
it tricky to identify.
Yes. And of course, nonverbal social skills. So things like reading body language and facial expressions and tone of voice. But what I wanted to say was about the fine and gross motor coordination piece is they learn more kinesthetically. So if they have to look at their feet to see which pedal to push on the bicycle, you tend to run into things.
Correct.
And my daughter couldn't learn to play the piano because she couldn't look at the music and her fingers at the same time.
There you go.
So these are very clear descriptions when we say visual spatial, right?
Mm-hmm.
And fine motor coordination. It's about your brain. And it's how your brain is coordinating these nonverbal cues that the rest of us read. And so that's why that's part of the definition of nonverbal learning disability, and the new diagnosis of visual spatial learning disability is what's being submitted to the DSM now, because so many people get confused by the name nonverbal learning disability.
Mm-hmm.
They think it means the person can't talk. So next is auditory processing disorder.
Auditory processing has to do with how your brain processes sound, auditory stimulation.
Not your ears.
Right.
It's not a hearing problem.
It's not a hearing problem. It's how your brain processes that information. So
what makes it difficult to hear when Nicole and I talk at the same time, which happens all the time. We're just like that, and we've always done it, and we do it in our private conversations too.
Yep.
We're just both really talkative people. You wouldn't be able to tell, you know, a neurotypical person might be able to focus on one of us versus the other, and a person with auditory processing disorder could not tell the difference.
Going to have a hard time.
So if they're in a noisy classroom, it could be hard to understand what the teacher's saying.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the story I was always told is think about a cocktail party, but I don't think anyone goes to cocktail parties anymore. But I went to grad school many decades ago. They still had cocktail parties. And the point of it being is you might be in a conversation with one person over here while 10 other people are having conversations. Mm-hmm. And a neurotypical person can focus on the one person and tune out all the rest. And a person with auditory processing disorder cannot do that. It does require specialized testing.
Mm-hmm.
Not
just more of a neurological condition. So
yes,
it's not something that's usually going to be identified in a evaluation at the school.
Because no one there is trained to do it, and even many audiologists are not trained to assess it. You have to find someone who's specialized.
There can be signs of it popping up in some traditional testing and some of the processing components, and you can see kind of the effects of, oh, they might have an auditory processing issue, especially when it comes to, like, you know, if you're giving multi-step directions and they're still processing number 1 when it gets to number 4, so they're missing directions. Things like that can be clues, and ways to kind of adapt to those, you know, to accommodate them can be remembering that anything that is auditorily mediated, we're going to need to find ways to make it visual or more concrete for those kids to be able to manage.
Right. So written schedules, written directions. Mm-hmm. You can't just teach verbally because these kids will miss it. Now, many other kids will miss it too for other reasons.
Sure.
ADHD kids or NLD kids or autistic kids will all miss it for all different reasons. But auditory processing disorder means you miss it because your brain is not processing sounds properly.
Right.
And so then we have language processing disorder. And this is including vocabulary, grammar, and sentence structure. So language processing disorders mean you hear what's said to you. You might even be able to read it really well. But you're going to see, you know, hints of what we said about dysgraphia here. It comes out in a jumble. And they're not able to make coherent sentences or paragraphs or learn to go past, you know, 3-word sentences because they don't, these students don't process language the same way.
Right.
So they have more limited vocabulary. They can't learn harder vocabulary words or too many vocabulary words at once. So some of the key ways you start seeing this is in elementary school, they give 20-word spelling tests. And there are just kids who get 6 of those words and can't do all 20. Well, there's, again, several things. It could be dyslexia. It could be dysgraphia. But it could be a language processing.
And that's why we do assessments. So that we can figure out where the problem is.
Right.
And address it appropriately.
Exactly. And so this is your kid who, receptive language, we talked about this last time under communication, or several times ago under communication assessments. Receptive language is understanding what you hear. Expressive language is being able to say what you want to say. That's a language processing disorder if the person is not able to get their needs and wants expressed properly. So that is, and the last one, how could I miss it, is visual processing. And this is, they can't see the board, and it's not a problem with glasses. This is a brain problem again, just like auditory was not a hearing problem. This problem can't be fixed by glasses. It can be helped because you can see what's on the board, but you might not be able to make sense of it. And there's a very easy test for this, which is so interesting to me, but it's called the Ray's-Osterrith test. And it's basically a triangle, and inside it are, it's a rectangle, and inside it are triangles and circles and X's and squares. And you look at it, and they take it away, and you have to copy it by memory.
Standard.
And then 15 minutes later, you have to do it again, right? And a neurotypical person can reproduce this complex figure without any difficulty, even 15 or 20 minutes later, missing only small details. And a person with visual processing deficits cannot. They cannot reproduce this drawing. And so it's the easiest way to be able to test, is this person's brain processing the information they saw?
Right.
And unfortunately, in school, it's really important to be able to process things visually because you have, not only your chalkboard or smartboard where your teacher is writing their lessons that you have to process. You have pictures in a textbook. You might have posters on the wall teaching material or repeating material you were supposed to learn. And you have to be able to reproduce all that information. And if you're not processing it visually, then you're not getting all the information correctly.
Yeah. My son has, and actually I have it too, but don't have my glasses yet, but has a visual processing disorder called Irlen syndrome. It primarily, it's worse with like black text on a white background, right? The letters will float off.
Traditional text.
Cross each other. They will, drop end of words kind of disappear. Different letters or small words disappear. It's worse in fluorescent lighting, which our schools are full of. So he will wear a hat a lot of times to kind of block some of that visual we have on his IEP, to have him placed close to windows whenever possible. And then he has these specially tinted glasses that help correct. So his colors are blue and gray. Mine are like more of the fuchsia color, which is why sometimes I'll wear, where are they?
You have sunglasses with red lenses.
That I'll wear sometimes.
It's an amazing thing. People don't realize that it really is a real thing. But
we couldn't figure out why he
did glasses, and also just coloring changing the shape of the font and the color of the paper you printed.
Yes, we print everything on blue paper. His teachers print all of his assignments on blue paper, and it helps significantly. And we didn't know why we could never get him to finish a book. And then we learned later on it was really exhausting for him to read for more than like 5 minutes.
There's also,
we didn't start to figure it out until he started reading music, and his teacher was like, okay, play the note. And he's like, well, which one? Like,
right, because
what do you mean?
it all blurs.
Because it would move from line to line. It made it very difficult to read music.
Absolutely. And when we talk about both visual processing disorder and dyslexia, which has similar issues with letters not appearing in their right order or not being able to decode a full word, there are new fonts available for your in word processing programs. And if it doesn't come in the version, one that comes in everybody's Microsoft Word, for example, is Verdana, Verdana. It has been tested scientifically to show that people with dyslexia and visual issues find it easier to read than the typical Times New Roman that textbooks are printed in. And the Arial or Helvetica or whatever it is that we get on our screens, Verdana is much more easy to comprehend because of the way the letters are shaped. And a new font was created, I think it's about 10 or 15 years ago now, called Dyslexie. And so it's Dyslexiie, I think, but I'll check the spelling. And so you can download that to your computer as well. It was created specifically to help people with dyslexia read more easily, because just like you're describing with the floating letters in your visual processing deficit, the fonts that we use, just like cursive is easier to write than printed, using fonts that don't have what we call serifs. Those are those little jaggedy bits at the tops and bottoms, and that have the circular letters like A and E and G and P and B and Q. Those are the letters that are often confusing for students with visual issues or dyslexic issues, are easier read in these other fonts.
Right. I had a demonstration one time at a conference I was at, and he was saying, here, one of the problems with these kids when they're, people with dyslexia and things, when they're learning to read is, and he took off his watch and he held it up. He's like, okay, if it's this way, it's still a watch. If it's this way, still a watch. If it's this way, still a watch. If it's this way, still a watch. Right. Now look at the letters E, B, D, and Q. It's the same thing, but if you flip it, it's very different.
Exactly. It's a great example. I love it. So I think what's really important for parents to know about these is that like all the other disabilities we've been discussing, your child can have more than one. Right. And that can be confusing. Like we already talked about some overlap in dyslexia and dyscalculia when there's word problems. Can they not do word problems because it's reading, or can they not do word problems because it's math? We just talked about the issues with visual processing. Is it dyslexia? Is it a visual processing problem? Sorting out what's seeing and hearing, so you need glasses or hearing aids, from brain function in auditory or visual processing. So that does require extensive evaluation. And I would say the majority of schools are not equipped to do that more intensive type of investigation. In fact, they require outside specialists. Particularly you need a developmental optometrist for not an ophthalmologist who's a medical doctor that deals with medical issues of the eye, but not a regular optometrist who does your glasses, but a developmental optometrist who specializes in these brain issues that can impact our reading and seeing, a specialized audiologist. There's only one, many people have heard of the ABLE filter, ABLE, which is a proven piece of equipment. It looks just like a hearing aid. It just sticks in your ear. It's proven to help improve auditory processing disorder. And there's only one place in the country that makes them. It's actually in Boulder, Colorado, about an hour from where I live. So there are some medical interventions for these things, but most of the time we can really help kids with just a lengthy list of accommodations.
Right. So let's talk about, qualification for
eligibility.
Eligibility for specific learning disability. So this one can get a little bit complicated because there are a few different pathways that you can get there and the intersection of the two. So we have what's called the discrepancy model and then the response to intervention model. And states often have different guidelines on how they apply eligibility for learning disabilities. So some things to watch out.
Can I say one thing before you go there?
Because
I actually think there's one thing we should say before we talk about that. Okay. And that is what I'm flipping to the right page in my handout here. And I went too far. It's page 20. Here we go. Before we say that, let me tell you what the federal determination is, because then we can talk about what tools the schools use to meet those criteria, which is what you were going to talk about, right? Yeah. So the federal definition, like we talked about in all the other forms of disability last week, is based upon a body of evidence that the student does not achieve adequately for their age or grade level, and we'll talk about those later in terms of our twice exceptional students another time, in one or more of the following areas. So that's all the criteria for we listed 7 disabilities, but the skills involved, and we said this last week, oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, reading skills, reading fluency, that's speed, reading comprehension, mathematical calculation, mathematical problem solving. That's the word problems and the algebra. Specifically, the team must determine that this is where the piece that Nicole's talking about comes in. Yeah. The team must determine that the student has one or more significant academic skill deficits. The student is making insufficient progress in response to research or evidence-based interventions, and the student's learning disabilities are not primarily the result of visual, hearing, or motor disabilities, limited intellectual capacity, serious emotional disability. These are the categories we talked about last time. Or cultural factors, economic disadvantage, or limited English proficiency. So they have to meet the criteria for one of the categories. They have to show they're not making progress in some way. And we'll talk about the 2 ways most states do it. And it's not primarily the result of one of the other categories, or lack of English or lower economic status.
Instruction.
Or poor instruction. So that's actually the criteria for all of them. But schools have several ways to determine if you're eligible. And Nicole, I'll pass the floor back to you.
Right. So most schools these days are doing kind of some basic screeners in those early elementary ages on reading and math. Let's see, what is it? Acadience and they're all called different things. Dibbles was the one they were using for a long time. I think they've moved.
Dibbles is still used everywhere.
Okay.
Everywhere, all over the country.
Is something different.
Yeah.
these days, but they're just basic screeners just to see where kids are. And so they'll kind of let you know if they're performing on grade level, above grade level, or below grade level. Typically, if kids are performing under, then the schools will have some sort of what they will call a response to intervention group, or a my brain is not working.
A lot of places call it NTSS now, which means
Okay.
multi-tiered system.
Yeah.
Something.
So the schools will have a tiered approach, right? So you'll have kind of everybody needs this much instruction. Then the middle tier is kind of the kids who just need a little bit extra. And then the top tier would be your special ed kids. So it's going to be this middle tier instruction where they will take those kids and try and give them a little bit of extra instruction and see how they respond. So the methods, they should be using a research and evidence-based intervention. So they're not just making something up. They need to be keeping good data on how your kid is progressing or not. And they will usually do kind of like a 6 to 8 week group and then see where they are. And if they're responding, if they're making progress, they might graduate out of that group or keep them in there for another little bit of time and see how they're doing if they're still not quite performing well. And that's kind of, if they're not making progress, then they may refer them for special ed services, refer them to be tested to see if they need further intervention. So that's where kind of the they call the response to intervention model, right? Like we're going to give them some extra instruction. We're going to see how they do. If they catch up, if they're doing great, awesome. If they don't, and we need further intervention, then we're going to look at some special ed services. And then the other model is called this discrepancy model. And so that's where they're going to do the testing. They're going to do that cognitive testing and academic testing, and they're going to see, is there a big gap between between their ability, where they should be performing, and where they are performing. We used to have kind of these specific calculations we would do. We had what we called the discrepancy disk, and we would plug in the different scores. And if it hit a certain percentage, then we could qualify them there. They don't do it that way anymore. There's not kind of specific numbers that they have to hit. But
some places do still have cutoffs, but it's discouraged by the federal government, and there have been lawsuits about it. But a lot of states say you have to be below the 12th percentile or the 10th percentile in certain areas of deficit to be given the diagnosis or made eligible for services because of the diagnosis. It still exists, unfortunately.
Yeah. Hopefully, I mean, the way we were doing it before, it was like there had to be a certain percentage of discrepancy in order for them to qualify in a certain area, and it was like a game of plugging in different scores and trying to get that,
a lot better now.
Yeah, it was not great because you'd see a kid that you knew needed some help, and because that percentage was off by a little bit, and it may be because they were in a lower grade level, and so the discrepancy wasn't as big. And so fortunately there's a little more discretion on the team to be able to say, okay, this is their ability level is 125 and their reading is a 98, right? Like that's still a pretty significant difference for that kid. And even though their reading is showing up as average, right? If they are really struggling to keep up with stuff because of that discrepancy, then we can call it what it is and get the kid some help.
Exactly. And because this, again, look at that triangle that Nicole made, this whole bottom third, more than a third, practically half of all students, right, get screened and they say, great, go to first grade, second grade, third grade, seventh grade, 12th grade. That's almost half of all students. Then there's a small percentage of students in the second tier. They're still general education students, just like the first tier, though they may be given access to what's now available as RTI, response to intervention groups. That didn't exist 20 years ago. That's newer. And so some of the kids who don't meet the cutoffs now for the discrepancy model can be put in an RTI program, but they're not considered special education. Only that top, it's a very small number, as I said, about 12%. For example, Texas was limiting their special education students to only 8% of their school population, regardless of what people's scores were. They just took the 8% worse. This happened, 5 years ago.
No.
And there was a big lawsuit in Texas.
I'll bet. Oh, gosh.
Right. You can't just say, we're only going to serve 8% of our special ed students,
No.
We're going to let everybody else just stay in general population and give them a little small group instruction. Right. So there have been issues like that in other states. I had a client in Texas, so I know about the lawsuit there, but they were limiting, they only took the worst 8%. So here's the really key piece of information parents need to know. And that is, you can skip the entire RTI process at any time by making a written, keyword, written request to your school district that says, and you've heard us say this in previous sessions, but this is where it comes. You have that evaluation and you see how significant the kids' needs are. You see what disability categories they're eligible in. Remember, we said you can have a medical diagnosis of autism, but not an educational one. You can have a medical diagnosis of dyslexia, but not read badly enough to meet the cutoff in some states. You can skip that whole process by a written request for an IEP eligibility evaluation that includes, and you list the areas that you're concerned about: reading, attention, writing, math, whatever it is. And even if they want to place your child in RTI, they are no longer allowed to do that.
Right. They can't wait and put off your evaluation request until after they go through.
They can have a brief RTI, since they get 60 days, 8 weeks in most states. Some states it's 45. There's 1 or 2 states that's 75. But the federal requirement is 60 calendar days. That includes weekends. So 8 weeks from when you put in that written request to when they have completed their evaluation. And so if they want to do RTI during those 8 weeks as part of their assessment, great, gives us more data, but they must complete the rest of the IEP assessment. We've taught you all about that before, about all the other categories to assess in. They must complete that at the same time and have the full eligibility assessment completed by that 60-day window. So at any time, if you have concerns about your child and you want your child evaluated for special education, or you feel that whatever the school is doing is not sufficient despite asking for help, and perhaps they just put them in one of these tier 2, that's what it's called, tier 2 programs, RTI programs, where they're doing small group instruction, but you feel that's not covering all my kid's needs. My kid has a lot more going on.
And being in a reading group is not helping them in math.
Or with executive functioning skills, or their social emotional issues, right? All the things we've talked about before. And then you just have to make this written request, and it cuts the red tape, and you go straight to the IEP process. So it's important for parents to know that.
Yes. So the school, their usual path to refer kids for specific learning disabilities is going to be through this tiered intervention model. But you as a parent can request an evaluation for special education services at any time. And then the school has to either do that testing or provide enough data that shows that they don't need to do the testing, that the child doesn't qualify. And most of the time they're going to do that testing, because collecting all that data and making the justification for not doing the testing is a heck of a lot more work than just doing the testing. So,
and as we've also told you before, you can disagree with their decision not to test. That gives you other legal rights. You can disagree with their eligibility decision. These are all the times when an independent educational evaluation at the school's expense might come into play. An advocate, a professional special education advocate, can help you navigate a school that is not being accessible to you or your child, or refusing to provide services in a timely fashion. But one of the key red flags is they say, oh, you have concerns, we'll put your kid in this small group we have, and that should fix the problem. And you say, boom, boom, I sent you the written request for the eligibility.
That's great.
Exam.
Go ahead and put them in there.
Do it now.
But also, I'm requesting an evaluation.
Right. So, right. It's important that you know as the parent that you have the decision-making power there. It's resides in you. You can cut.
That's why we talk about all of this all the time, is to help empower parents to be advocates for their kids. You know the system, you know what your rights are, what your child's rights are, and how to access them. That's why we talk about this. So
you hear phrases today that you've heard us say dozen times before, because they all interlock, and there's all steps in this process where you, the parent, can say to a school, this is what my kid needs, and this is the law that says you have to give it to my kid. So it's really important that parents be well-prepared advocates.
And we will talk kind of at the end of this series about what to do if that's not happening. What your options are, what your recourses are when the school is not doing what they're supposed to do. And we have both been down that avenue. I have with my own children. So there's things that you can do to hold the school accountable and to push back against it if they're not doing what they're legally obligated to do. So
exactly. And to keep it in a cooperative fashion, we want to stress that it doesn't have to be adversarial unless the school makes it adversarial.
Most of the time, it's not adversarial. We've said that before. Most of the time, these schools are trying to do what's best for kids. Most members of the team really do want to help your kid.
Yes.
Sometimes they get it wrong, and you, as a parent, get to be empowered in helping them to get it right. And you have rights, and so does your child, and they're important. So
I like the way you said that parents are empowered to help the school get it right. And I think that's a lovely way of putting it, Nicole, because that's what we really try to do. Is sometimes schools just they're following their school policy, and sometimes it doesn't follow the law. We're here
or they just forget, they just sometimes get in autopilot mode, and they think that they're doing, what they can, and they don't know that there's something else that they could be doing. And that's why parents are a part of that team, is because, you're the expert on your kid, and what they have been doing for other kids just might not be the thing that's going to work for your kid. And sometimes they just need to be reminded of that there are other options, and help them think outside of that box.
That's why it's called an individualized education plan. It can't be one size fits all unless that's the size that fits your kid.
Right. And that is what we will be talking about next week. We've finished up with eligibility, so we'll move on to the IEP process that comes after they're determined to be eligible.
Sounds great.
And we'll work through. That might take a couple of weeks as well.
If you have an IEP, sorry, didn't mean to step on you.
Nope, you're good.
If you have an IEP, anybody listening, your own child's IEP that you want to, don't send us the whole IEP, please. I can't read another 30-page IEP. But if you have one section you have questions about, like why did they do this, or why did they write that, or explain a piece of the IEP process, feel free to send us one of those little chunks or just a question about it to help us answer your questions more explicitly, so we know exactly what issues you, our listeners, are dealing with.
Awesome. All right. So we will wrap things up, and we will see you next week.
Bye, everybody. Bye, Nicole.
See you. thank you for watching. If you haven't already, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. This video is not a substitute for counseling, psychotherapy, medical, or mental health care. The information and advice shared here should not be used in place of any form of diagnosis, treatment, or therapy. Information provided here does not involve diagnosis or treatment of medical or mental or psychological disorders. If you feel the need for professional support, please seek a local professional in your area. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only.